Everyone in the US, and good morning to those of you that have come here from Australia. My name is Suzanne Barnett and I'm hosting your webinar for you today. So those of you that have been here for the past series, we just go through a quick check to ensure that you can hear me properly, and if you could do that by clicking on your hand button to indicate that you can hear me, or if you can't find the hand button, just type in the question box that yes, you can hear me. So I'm seeing lots of hands go up very, very quickly, so that's excellent. Okay, thank you. Just checking with some others. So Kim, Catherine, Scott, if you could either put your hand up or write in the question box that you can hear. Okay, and I'm just going to put those hands down. I'd like to check that you can see the screen. So you should be seeing our first slide, which is the introduction to the presentation today, SNP Learning Series Presentation 5, Trans-sulfuration Pathway. Excellent, hands are going up. I'll just wait for a few more hands. So this is checking that you can see the screen, please. Super. Thank you everyone. Okay, so as usual, I'd like to suggest that you switch off any other applications that you've got on your screen at the moment. It does affect the quality of the broadcast that you get, and there's nothing that we can do about it. But by switching off those applications, it just means that you'll get the maximum broadband. We will be aiming to finish by 1 p.m. today, and we have allocated time at the end for questions. So do pop your questions into the question box, and we'll address those at the end. As I said, our topic for today is Learning Series Presentation 5, Trans-sulfuration Pathway, presented once again by Sterling Hill, Carolyn Ladowski and Cynthia Smith. And the first part of today's presentation will be done by Carolyn Ladowski.
Hi everybody, and thanks for joining us. We've got, I think this is probably one of the most interesting of the pathways, and certainly the one where we will get the most questions, I would say. So if we first look at trans-sulfuration pathway, it's important because we all know by now that it is one of two ways in which homocysteine is metabolized, but predominantly it is the only pathway for the elimination of homocysteine in the body. And we also know that it is a key route for our ability to create glutathione. So it has very important implications in liver detoxification. And because of that, it is then crucial in our ability to get rid of these reactive oxygen species and ensure that we are detoxifying and getting rid of free radicals. And so it's very important in oxidative stress. Here's, thanks to Ben Lynch, he's our pathway planner that he did on the trans-sulfuration pathway. And you can see there in the center, you've got your CBS. So if we look here, we've got homocysteine, we've got our CBS gene, our CTH. Now these are both, as you can see, B6 dependent. And then the trans-sulfuration pathway continues down here to glutathione, and you can see both your reduced and oxidized there. Here's where we create our taurine, and here's our sulfur detoxification, very important. But one of the really key things to remember is with this cysteine gene, we are actually creating the substrates we need for our citric acid cycle. So it's absolutely crucially important, particularly when we're talking about mitochondrial energy. So Sterling is actually going to run through these first key 3 genes. So I'm going to hand over to Sterling, and we've got some slides up behind Sterling so you can read through some of the things that she will be talking about. Sterling?
Hi. Okay, CBS, that one's cysteine beta synthase, and its cofactor is P5P, that is vitamin B6, a form of B6. In most cases, we see more of a downregulation than an upregulation when people are chronically ill that have CBS, and that has to do with the need for vitamin B6. People with Down syndrome will have more of an upregulation. Others will have sensitivity P5P and or lysine is low. So people with pyroluria, oxalate issues, high glutamate, low GABA usually have an issue here with more of a downregulation than an upregulation of CBS. What is something I learned from Susan Custon Owens? There is no evidence that the C699T SNP is involved in an upregulation. You would have to give someone a 5-gram load of methionine for an upregulation to occur, and that does not happen in nature. Oxalates and B6 have everything to do with sulfation, by the way. Also, restricting sulfur in anyone who does not have SUOX or Down syndrome can be dangerous. It makes it to where you can't resolve the situation here. It makes it where sulfur wasting and trapping cannot be resolved at all. Ben Lynch contacted me one time after he had someone come to him who had a stroke. And what led to her stroke is because she was looking on these boards and was told she had CBS and she was treating the SNP and not herself. And she restricted her sulfur intake for so long that she had no sulfur, very low sulfur in the body. Sulfur controls blood pressure regulation. That's why most blood pressure medications are sulfur-based. So that was very interesting to learn there. He actually pulled her out of her predicament she was in with the elevated blood pressure by adding sulfurs back into her diet. Sulfates, on the other hand, do need to be regulated with those who have G6PD deficiency, and the actual deficiency, not looking at the SNP, but knowing through lab work that they are deficient. Also, people with SUOX and low molybdenum, and people with Down syndrome, they do need to use some restrictions there. Glutathione, again, is a sulfur-based molecule, and without it, we die. Every cell in the body needs glutathione, and if it's a sulfur-based molecule, restricting sulfur in most cases can do more harm than good on someone who's chronically ill. And again, CBS, if B6, the cofactor there, is not in place and somebody has low B6 levels, they can even have low lysine and have B6, but the lysine's needed for the B6 to be utilized in the body properly. So that's very important to be looking at when you see somebody with CBS. Now, CTH. CTH is cysteine gamma lyase, and its cofactor, again, is B6. Okay, CTH is the last step in the trans-sulfuration pathway from methionine to cysteine. It converts cysteine into cysteine. In many cases, when there is a problem here, you will see elevated cysteine and low cysteine. You can also see low B6, more or less P5P. Also low lysine, low zinc, low potassium, low iron, low magnesium, low manganese, low homocysteine, high glutamate, low GABA, also elevated oxalates, and elevated 3-methylhistidine. People with pyroluria, you'll see, will have issues here too. Kidney stones, interstitial cystitis, fibromyalgia, chronic fatigue, histamine intolerance. I don't know if I said the low homocysteine, but low homocysteine if I haven't, and low creatinine. And all this is based on sulfur being trapped and being wasted too. So again, P5P, look at that B6 on those people, and then also their lysine as well, because lysine is needed for B6. Now, the GSS and the GSR we went over in the in another series a few weeks back, but again, GSS, GSR, a lot to do with sulfation. Glutathione is a sulfur-based molecule, and without it, we don't have life. We have to have glutathione in the body to detox and heal. Now, MUT, that's methylmalonic-CoA mutase, and it is related to methylmalonic aciduria and MUT-related methylmalonic acidemia. and it is involved in the degradation of several amino acids, odd-chain fatty acids, and cholesterol, as well as the need for adenosyl B12. Without adenosyl B12 in the body, you'll see people with low MMA, and you'll also see you'll see that no energy, very poor energy, and also sometimes elevated cholesterol levels. So when you're looking at those genes related to methylmalonic acid, please, if you can, check methylmalonic acid. It's an easy test to get these days. It's a lot better than beach blood testing. And Carolyn, I believe I'm done there. I think it's back to you.
Yes, thanks, Sterling. Okay, so let's have a look at this pathway a little closer. So you remember that we were saying that homocysteine to methionine through the BHMT, that's one route of recycling. But it's really what we call this trans-sulfuration. As Sterling said, it's very much B6 dependent. And the majority of homocysteine, up to 78%, is metabolized through this trans-sulfuration pathway. So if you're seeing people with high homocysteine, you've really got to be checking this pathway and ensuring that there is sufficient B6. Now, this CBS is also unique because it's the only B6 dependent enzyme that is also heme dependent. And therefore, if we're seeing changes in the redox status of heme, then the CBS may be at issue. And I think as far as the CTH and the CSE, it's the catalyst for cysteine to cysteine and alpha-ketobutyrate. And this is how we make hydrogen sulfide. So remember, Sterling was just saying that the CBS is such a crucial pathway for cardiovascular disease, and that's why, and I'm going to be talking about hydrogen sulfide in a little bit more, but it's one of our key gas emitters like nitric oxide that cause vasoconstriction and vasodilation. So the ability of our capillaries to move in and out in response to blood pressure changes is crucial. And so without sufficient hydrogen sulfide and nitric oxide, this doesn't happen. You can see also there that alpha-ketobutyrate is a subchain of this. And so it's very much, it's transported into our mitochondrial matrix, and it's then converted to propionyl-CoA by our big branch chain alpha-keto acid dehydrogenase complex. Big complex. And it then goes on to produce succinyl-CoA, and with the propionyl-CoA, it uses biotin as a cofactor. And that's how we then get our S-methylmalonyl-CoA. So, and that's what Sterling was just talking about, which is the cofactor is adenosyl cobalamin. So it really has a very important part to play in our citric acid cycle. And you can see that if your CBS pathway, CBS gene, your CTH gene isn't working to get a sufficient alpha-ketobutyrate, then you're going to have issues. If you look there from cysteine, you can see that PAPS is a very important part, and Cynthia and I are both going to talk a little bit about that today. But that's your sulfate pathway. That's how you detoxify your sulfur, but it's also how you create sufficient PAPS for use with other really important enzymes. So here you can see very much the same thing, but we've seen this slide a few times in that when you get low homocysteine or you've got a lot of oxidative stress, then instead of this cycling happening, you're going to shift the flow of homocysteine into the formation of cysteine so you can get glutathione. But, low homocysteine, we know that there's a very limited capacity for response to oxidative stress and toxins, because we need this at sufficient levels to have sufficient glutathione, taurine, and sulfate. But PAPS is 3-phosphoadenosine 5-phosphate sulfate, and it is the limiting factor in the whole sulfation pathway. So we will talk about PAPS in great detail, because it is a very important enzyme group. It's a very important pathway for us to understand. So here, as Sterling said, the CBS, we've got, you can have a look, there's probably about 90 mutations in the CBS gene. And the reason that there is so much controversy over this is that there's actually no research to suggest that this is an upregulation. There are things that upregulate it, but the gene mutation is not an upregulation. And it is often an amino acid substitution that affects the CBS's ability to bind to pyridoxal 5-phosphate or B6. And so we then, because of that change in the amino acid, we actually get a lack of enzyme activity. So when you're considering CBS pathway issues, you're considering the gene, think they're separate. On the whole, the CBS gene is causing a downregulation, but there are other factors that can upregulate the pathway. That's why it's confusing. It's important for the regulation of hydrogen sulfide, especially in the brain. That's why we get a lot of these neurological symptoms. So one of the first things that you think of if you're seeing CBS issues is people will say, I have terrible brain fog. I can't think properly. I feel thick all the time. That'll be their predominant symptom. And usually it's because they're not breaking down ammonia. So this pathway relies really closely on our nitric oxide synthase genes, because here we're creating the ammonia. Whenever we have protein in our food, we naturally will create ammonia. And it's up to this CBS and the nitric oxide synthase pathway to then detoxify it. So if you've got people that are eating lots of protein, so for example, the paleo craze, they're going to be eating mostly protein. They're going to be creating a lot of ammonia in the system. And if they've got nitric oxide synthase enzyme issues, they're not going to be able to detoxify it. And that's what's going to give them a lot of this heady stuff. Just a bit, Sterling spoke about oxalates, a really important component of this pathway, because it's again B6 dependent. And if you've got someone who's juicing buckets and buckets of beetroot and spinach, they're using all their B6 up to detoxify and break down those oxalates, which makes B6 unavailable for the CBS pathway. So there's a good website you can have a look. It's called lowoxalate.info. And Susan Costanoans has a fantastic list of foods that are high in oxalate. She does it by alphabetical category, and it's a really valuable resource. And anyone that you're seeing with thyroid issues, kidney stones in the family, recurrent candida, ADHD, you've got to be considering oxalates could be putting pressure on CBS. Here's some of our research. I'm not going to go into this in great detail because you've got all the references, but you can see some of the issues that are associated with a CBS, and you can see there, downregulate, downregulate, downregulate. So don't be thinking this is always upregulation. And here we've got our references. So this is really talking about the hydrogen sulfide component of it. And as I've said, it's one of our key signaling molecules. And the benefits are not only cardiovascular, but also neurological functions. And the research tells us that if nitric oxide is higher, it's more likely that hydrogen sulfide will be higher, and vice versa. They tend to work in unison. But they are all dependent on sulfur metabolism. So if we're looking at people with high or low blood pressure, and often you see people with very low blood pressure, so what's that telling us? That perhaps there's too much hydrogen sulfide in the system and their sulfur pathway is not working optimally to regulate that. And as you know, we get it mostly through our diet, and we've been told over and over again, when you see CBS restrict sulfur, but as Sterling has just told you, that's really not a very clever thing to be doing. Sure, if people have major issues with sulfur-based foods, we might want to try and regulate it by giving them some molybdenum, but we've then very quickly got to be balancing our sulfur pathway, ensuring that they are getting enough. And because remember, this trans-sulfuration pathway is irreversible. So cysteine can't be converted back to methionine. And CBS is present in many tissues in the body: liver, kidney, pancreas, small intestine, immune cells, particularly our macrophages, our T cells, our dendritic cells. So it's got major implications right across our biochemistry. And this pathway just shows you the cysteine biosynthesis and the selected genes that are involved in that. And as Sterling said, the 3-methyl histidine, which you can see there, you can see there that will have a big impact. I mean, if you see that at elevated levels, you do know that there's an issue with this table. So there's a lot of debate, as we said, and I'm sure we'll get questions about this, but there's really nothing to support the fact that it causes elevated taurine either. We do see elevated taurine, as Sterling said, in our ADD, ADHD, more often than not, and that's probably because we're seeing a lot of digestive issues with particularly those children. Many people present with ammonia detoxification issues. So if we can help ammonia detoxification by supporting our nitric oxide synthase, giving things like acetyl L-carnitine, alpha-ketoglutarate, they're things that will really help with ammonia detoxification. Be very careful in acetyl L-carnitine though with thyroid issues, because it will increase TSH levels. Often we see when you do a urinary amino acids, you do see a low taurine, not high, and you see a low B6. And we've already spoken about the oxalate issues, but it's really worth considering anyone that has pathway issues to look at their oxalate levels in their diet, and definitely look at nitric oxide synthase mutations. If you're seeing urea in bloods too high or too low and a low creatine, then that's also going to give you a clue that the nitric oxide synthase enzymes need support. So here we've got that pathway planner again, just to refamiliarize ourselves with the area that we're talking about, and you can see that, you know, where the SUOX gene. So Sterling's going to talk about the SUOX gene in a moment, but that's really where we're metabolizing sulfites. So that's important, and they're usually the people that have real issues with sulfur: onion, garlic, eggs, broccoli, cabbage, any sort of wine. They're the people that have the problem, and you can see there that molybdenum and B1 is the key cofactor. So this simply shows you again a subsection of this where you've got in the middle alpha-ketoglutarate, and it's important for the proper metabolism really of all our amino acids, and it's essential for our energy cycle and our citric acid cycle. So it's all tied in, all of this is tied in together, and it's probably one of the most important things that we see down in an organic acids test, is that the alpha-ketoglutarate is usually way too low. And here you've got your alpha-ketoglutarate butyrate that I was talking about before, which gives you the propionyl-CoA, and it feeds directly into the citric acid cycle. All right, so MUT pathway. So this, as Sterling said, it really has a major impact on our methylmalonic acid. And if we're seeing an elevated MMA, it's because we've probably got mutations in this MUT gene. And because it has such an important impact on our vitamin B12 transport into the mitochondria, and so does the MMAB. So remember, we said that adenosylcobalamin is our mitochondrial B12, whereas our neurological B12 is our methyl B12. So if you are looking at, often with this, you'll be looking at not only serum B12 but MMA levels. And you can see there too your citric acid cycle and the importance of alpha-ketoglutarate there in the middle. And not a lot of research around the particular MUT mutations, but certainly they do affect our homocysteine levels. So some of the signs and symptoms that you might expect to see with ammonia toxicity in the brain are any of these. So the one thing that more than anything is this real headache, lack of concentration, mental confusion, intellectual impairment. They'll often say, look, I just can't even think. And in the extreme, elevated ammonia is associated with almost like a complete stupor, an inability to, almost a catatonic state. That's in the very extreme. And we'll certainly talk more about the NMDA receptors when we talk about our ammonia and our comp genes later on. And the urea cycle, the nutrients that we help, as I've already said, acetyl-L-carnitine, betaine, arginine, choline, and I put in there alpha-ketoglutarate. So as we said, the key things that you'd be looking for is almost like a comatose presentation, and it's quite often you get patients that sit there and they can't really answer any of your questions whatsoever because they just can't think. And this is really a good indication that ammonia is an issue. And high ammonia depletes the concentration of glutamate, which produces a similar decrease of GABA, which impairs brain function. So we often say when someone has got digestive issues and they've got a lot of gut bugs, they're creating high ammonia. And ammonia not only comes from food and the breakdown of protein, but it definitely comes from bugs in the gut. And lack of energy will ensue because high ammonia will deplete cells of ATP. So what are we looking for, and what things are we going to look out for in these three? So as Sterling said, pyroluria. So pyroluria really comes hand in hand with this whole pathway. We not only see a very, very high correlation between homozygous MTHFR and pyroluria, but almost anyone that's got issues around ammonia, CBS, they will have this disturbance in copper, zinc, and B6. And predominantly because the oxalates will bind to zinc, they will bind to iron and B6 and make them unavailable. So that's a key issue. And because it's also heme related, you do get issues around the pyrols. Low homocysteine, it is just as bad as high, and I hope you all understand the reasons behind that now. Sleep issues obviously are a big impact. Oxidative stress, low cysteine, therefore low glutathione. Are there gut issues that might be increasing ammonia? Increased hydrogen sulfide often presents as dizziness, low blood pressure. High homocysteine will equate to low hydrogen sulfide, so it could actually mean that blood pressure is going to be higher because there's not as much vasodilation due to the low hydrogen sulfide. And CBS, things that you'll be looking in the diet: how do you tolerate onion, garlic, eggs, cabbage? They're the sort of questions that you should always be asking, because you'll then get a really good indication as to whether sulfur metabolism is a big issue. And I think we might talk more about pyrols in the question time, because it is a very big issue, and almost anyone that presents with any anxiety, you'll see that the pyrols are always elevated. Okay, so I'm going to hand over to Cynthia now, who's going to take you through just a recap on the glutathione and take you forward with the rest of the pathway. Over to you, Cynthia.
Thank you, Carolyn. So Carolyn mentioned that low glutathione low homocysteine is just as problematic as high homocysteine. And because glutathione is built from 3 amino acids, it's always best to check amino acid levels. You can use a NutriVal, a SpectraCell, or a variety of testing to make sure that the glycine, the cysteine, and the glutamic acid levels are okay. But so if somebody has low homocysteine, you could address it with N-acetylcysteine, which is the cysteine component, one of the 3, methionine, and then taurine, and then alpha-lipoic acid. And as the slide mentions, you have to be careful when you start tinkering with the CBS pathway. About half of the body's total flux of cysteine is accounted for by turnover of glutathione. And remember that glutathione reductase requires copper and FAD from vitamin B2 in order to work. So generally when you start working with people, it's always a good idea to look at their basic B vitamin levels, the B1, B2, B3, because again, those relate back to the Krebs cycle. So the roles of glutathione are big. Besides being its own phase 2 liver detox pathway, it's also important for many, many other things. So scavenging free radicals, removing hydrogen and lipid peroxides. But what's not really mentioned in the slide, which I see all the time in the clinical setting, is people with autoimmune issues usually have low glutathione. And so one of the best things you can do in that case is to make sure that you're checking their CBS pathway or their trans-sulfuration pathway and making sure they have sufficient glutathione. It's not only mitochondrial effects and liver detox, but there's a huge link with autoimmune conditions, which I see so much now. I mean, Hashimoto's is on the rise. So glutathione goes back and forth between an oxidative state and an oxidized form and a reduced form. So this next slide talks about the role of glutathione in regulation. So it's intracellular redox status. The other thing that's important that's in this list is the protein glutathione elation, and that is becoming increasingly recognized as playing a role in cardiovascular disease and disorders. So because that regulates numerous psychological processes involved in cardiovascular homeostasis, we're starting to see that this pathway is also, besides just homocysteine, because everybody focuses on high homocysteine, there's also this issue of glutathione. So again, it's important to look at glutathione levels and status if you're dealing with somebody who's got some cardiovascular issues. So the next slide is a slide about the glutathione synthase. activity, cofactors. We've talked about this before. Magnesium is important. This material is actually from the compendium, which I know a lot of you have ordered. But one of the things to look out for with the mutations in the GSS area are anemia and acidosis and some neurological problems that go back to what we talked about before with the high ammonia. Usually when there's issues with glutathione being low, there's also issues with ammonia being high because that pathway is being diverted. This next drawing is a takeoff from the pathway planner from Ben Lynch. And I included it in here because I wanted you to see more clearly how the Krebs cycle is affected. After CTH, you've got that whole chain going to the Krebs cycle. I know Carolyn refers to it as the citric acid cycle, which is probably the formal name now, but it used to be, back in the day I learned that it was the Krebs cycle. But the Krebs cycle is where we make our energy, our ATP. That's the currency of our body, our energy currency. So you can see that if this pathway has flaws in it, and either CBS or CTH, it's going to affect your energy levels. And the Krebs cycle and the production of ATP is important, not only to make energy for us, but also the housekeeping of all of our cells. So you'll see that if you've got issues in this pathway, the cell function itself starts to degrade. This is just a kind of a reference here. This figure is discussing the roles and metabolism of glutathione. GPX reduces various peroxides, as Carolyn mentioned, including hydrogen peroxide, by the electrons donated from GSH. The resultant GSSG enzyme is then reduced back to GSH by GSR. And that conversion requires electrons donated from NADPH supplied from the PPP pathway, which we'll discuss later. We're going to put a pretty comprehensive set of slides in for the pentose phosphate pathway, I think in class number 9 and possibly 11. But GSH not only supplies electrons to peroxides, but also plays multiple roles in cells. So anyway, that's just a good reference drawing. And this drawing also plays into what we discussed in phase 2 liver detox last week. So the research on the alleles, on the risk alleles for GSS, for the various RS numbers, shows that for the first one, 2273684, the risk allele is T. And what's interesting is that this particular risk allele conferred a decreased risk of SLE in African Americans in the early screening. So one of the things you have to look at when you look at these SNPs is, yes, they may be causing problems now, but at some point in the evolution of our species, they might have conferred a benefit. But in our current environment, that might not be a benefit. You'll see that a lot when we get to the some of the immune SNPs with HLA. So you can see that the risk allele in the third one down is associated with an increased risk of glutathione synthase deficiency. But the research is there if you want to look that up. So the trans-sulfuration pathway SNPs, Sterling's going to discuss those next.
Hi, okay. The SLUT genes, particularly the 1A1, 1C3, and 2A1, are really important. Sulfonylureas is very, very important in the body. It's sulfonylureas 1A1, 2A1, and 1C3 utilize PAPs as a sulfonate donor. And a little something that I learned from Susan Costin-Owens about how sulfonylureas and PAPs work with B6. When B6 activity is low, the body starts making endogenous oxalate. This harms oxidative phosphorylation, so you stop making sufficient ATP. That can cause sulfur wasting into the urine, since sulfate cannot then be used for sulfation. Sulfate has to be converted into PAPs. PAPs is 3-phospho-5-adenylyl sulfate. SLUT 1A1, 1C3, and 2A1 are sulfonylureas genes. They utilize PAPs as a sulfonate donor. And a little something I learned from Susan Costin-Owens I'll talk about now. When B6 activity is low, the body starts making endogenous oxalate. This harms oxidative phosphorylation, so you stop making sufficient ATP. That can cause sulfur wasting into the urine, since the sulfate cannot then be used for sulfation. Sulfate has to be converted into PAPs to be used to sulfate anything, and that requires ATP. Again, B6, in particular P5P deficiency, will cause sulfonylureas genes to express negatively. And remember, you need lysine for B6 to hook to receptors and be utilized. Without PAPs, you cannot catalyze the sulfonation of steroids and bile acids in the liver and adrenal glands. Now, SUOX, S-U-O-X, the cofactors for SUOX are heme and molybdenum. Can we go to the next slide? This is SUOX. Thank you. SUOX. Now, SUOX cofactors are heme and molybdenum. It is crucial to have the sulfation pathway working properly for people with a SUOX mutation. You will never see someone homozygous for SUOX. They cannot survive. So it is important to address the ones who are heterozygous. Keeping an eye on their molybdenum and sulfate intake is crucial. Okay. Well, I think Cynthia is next, right? Cynthia?
Okay, so the SULT1 pathway is really important, and Sterling mentioned this, but I want to make sure everybody caught that. SULT and a number of other enzymes are really important in the creation of bile. And so when I see somebody with SULT1 SNPs, I start looking through their variant report for other SNPs that could be associated, like PEMT, MAT, looking for other SNPs that could be contributing to the possible production of kind of sludgy bile, which then means that what's being stored in their gallbladder from the liver isn't efficiently breaking down fatty foods and isn't efficiently assisting in assimilating the vitamins that are fat-based, like A, D, E, and K. So, but you can see that this is a very important pathway. It functions in the brain, the colon, the kidneys, all over. But the one that I look at the most is besides obviously CBS pathway, the trans-sulfuration, is I really look at a person's ability to assimilate fats from their diet and the quality of their bile. And I use the test called GIFX to look at how well they're assimilating fats. So the next slide is the various RS numbers on the variant report and some of the research associated with the risk alleles. I don't want to read it, but the one at the bottom, the RS6722745, that risk allele is associated with colon cancer. So keep that in mind when you're looking at somebody's variant report. The next slide is the SULT2 pathway, and the thing that's important to take away from this one is that PAPS is required, and PAPS is the sulfate donor co-substrate for all the SULT enzymes. And then these SULT enzymes catalyze the sulfate conjugation of many endogenous and exogenous compounds like drugs and xenobiotics. And so when we went through phase 2 liver detox, we had a whole section on sulfation. So these are important, but it's more than just phase 2 liver detox. As I mentioned before, these SULTs are all over the body. These enzymes work all over the body. So they're important. There's quite a few on the variant report, but when you see an SULT SNP, it means something. A lot of times you'll see like a list of 8, enzyme RS numbers, and some of them are very meaningful and some are not, but these SULTs are meaningful. SULT, here's another slide with the different risk alleles, and you can see there's not a lot of research on SULT, on the SULT2A1s, but if you see some of them, they're usually downregulated expression, so meaning that the enzyme is not working as efficiently as it should. The next slide is labeled the SUOX pathway, but the takeaway here is that in this particular slide, this was taken from Dr. Yasko's book, and she was highlighting what happens with a CBS upregulation, or actually, as we've discussed tonight, it's not really an upregulation, it's more of a dysregulation, and that dysregulation impact has to do with other things, but it's basically a dysregulation. So what you'll see here is a person with this kind of profile with some of these CBS SNPs. They'll have a problem generating a sulfur breakdown products. They will have low glutathione, they will have higher ammonia and the brain fog that Carolyn talked about, and they'll be stressing the urea cycle. And remember that the urea cycle, there's actually 2 pathways where you can break down ammonia, but the primary one that Carolyn mentioned before was NOS, nitric oxide synthase. But for nitric oxide synthase to effectively break down ammonia into nitric oxide and citrulline, which are what we want, it requires BH4, tetrahydrobiopterin. And so what happens is over time that tetrahydrobiopterin becomes depleted, and the byproducts of nitric oxide synthase trying to break down ammonia become these peroxynitrates and superoxides, which again have a cost, downstream to some of the other enzymes in our mitochondrial health. The other thing is when you deplete BH4, now you're not having the cofactors that you need for your serotonin and dopamine production. So when you see this kind of CBS dysregulation and high ammonia, you're impacting things downstream and then upstream coming back to our methylation. So this is a big deal. This pathway is super important to look at, and to look at all the nuances of the SNPs that are associated with the trans-sulfuration pathway. Now these are foods that are rich in sulfur. One of the things we used to do in the old days, and by old days I mean like 4 years ago, is when somebody had a CBS C699T or an A360A SNP, the standard protocol, which we don't do anymore, was lower their sulfur levels, give them different supplements to help them break down, the nitrogen in their food, and it was just crazy. It didn't work. It was people with skin disorders had more skin disorder once you took the sulfur out. Sulfur is extremely important, not only for the trans-sulfuration pathway, but also for sulfation and phase 2 liver detox. And so when you're dealing with something, some of these issues in the trans-sulfuration pathway, it's really important to not take out all the sulfur. You can titrate it, right? You can reduce it, but be really careful because our body really needs sulfur.
If a client is taking P5P and methylcobalamin, will it affect test results?
What sort of, do they mean any test results or?
Okay, Sharon, if you could write in and be more specific with that would be great.
That's actually Cynthia's mic again, so I've just muted Cynthia for a minute to see if we can get that working again.
Okay, so Sharon says here any test results.
Oh, okay. So normally if the P5P and the cobalamin, any supplements that you give are obviously going to skew. So if you're trying to work out a level that is working for the patient or not, then you should actually keep them taking their supplements, obviously not the morning of, but if you're trying then to gauge an initial baseline, it's probably better they're not on them at all. That's what I would say. Cynthia, I'm going to unmute you and just see if the mic continues to play up because I know you'll probably want to make a comment. Okay.
When I initially test somebody, so I have their genetics, I have this 19-page health history, and we go through everything. We do testing without supplements. Then we see by testing and looking at vitamin levels, mineral levels, fatty acid levels, amino acid levels, I can actually see how these pathways are working and interplaying with their genetics. And then later, if we retest in 6 months or 9 months, then we can take the supplements that we've worked on and the dietary changes we've worked on and then test to see how well we're doing. And so we have a comparison between, the before and the after. But there's always a little tweaking at the end, right? And as you start to open up these pathways, specifically this trans-sulfuration pathway first, to get that thing working right because it impacts so many other pathways, then you can, again, retest later on the supplements and on the dietary changes to see how you're doing.
Is Suox on the MTHFR panel? And I presume that they're talking about Sterling's variant report, and the answer is yes, it is. And Sterling, you might want to actually say something about that.
Yeah, this Suox is it's not the exact Suox mutation that Dr. Yasko has on her report, but the Suox goes hand in hand with that particular Suox, kind of like comp V158M and H62H go together. So it is that rare find on the variant report, and that one works just like one that Dr. Amy Yasko has on her variant report. There were several, there was about 8 Suox SNPs on 23andMe's raw data. None of them had prevalence but this one. And you may only see 1 out of 1,000 people that do have this particular Suox SNP. But when you come across them and they're heterozygous, yes, please know that, first check their molybdenum, ask them how they handle sulfurs and stuff because it's going to be a problem. Again, like I said, homozygous, they're not born because they can't handle sulfur, they can't make glutathione, so they die. So that's how important looking at Suox is and making sure that sulfation pathway is open. You will find it on the variant report.
Okay. Thank you for that. Jennifer's just saying here, could you put up the slide again about the compendium?
Yes, it's up now. Yep.
Oh, yeah, I can see that. Okay. And Sharon's just saying, how many days does the client have to stop the supplements before testing?
Ideally, most of the labs will say 4 to 5 is the absolute ideal. But the problem with that is if you've got someone with really elevated pyrols and you know that 4 to 5 days are going to really be without it, that it's not viable because a lot of the time with the pyroluria, if they don't take their B6 and zinc for a day, their anxiety levels will go back up through the roof. So I say 48 hours, but if you can do it, make sure it's 4 or 5.
Okay, excellent. Now, are there any more questions from anybody else? We haven't got any more on the question box, so this is your chance to put some more questions up. Is there anything else that you want to add, Carolyn, Cynthia, or Sterling?
No, just that, you know, the whole pyroluria issue is really interesting for this particular part of the pathway. And I think, as I said to everyone before, I don't really think it's a standalone thing called pyroluria. I really think that what pyroluria is it's a subsection, it's an issue around CBS, and whether that's oxalates, whether it's other things using up B6, whether it's zinc is low because, again, they're binding to oxalates, whether it's because there's gut dysfunction and the absorption of zinc is not there. It could be many reasons. So I think always check for the pyrols, but then consider that it really is an issue around the B6 and zinc binding, and iron too. And often you see people with really low iron, and as soon as you correct CBS issues, their iron goes up with no supplementation because it's not binding anymore.
Okay. We've got, I'm not sure how to pronounce your name, so I apologise for this. Micheline or Micheline?
Micheline.
Will pyrols reduce when appropriately supplemented and just determined by retesting?
Yes. Yes, they will. They will reduce, and they reduce pretty quickly if you're also supplementing, you know, if you're supporting the rest of the pathway, and it could be just a few months. And in reality, people do not need to be on pyrol support for life. And a lot of the problem that we see in Australia is there's compounding products that are being made up for patients with huge amounts of pyridoxine, sometimes 200 milligrams, and P5P at 100 milligrams. And the issue is homocysteine is being depleted hugely. So we are actually doing them a great disservice if we are pushing that high B6 and high zinc without checking homocysteine levels to ensure that there is enough to support their glutathione. So we really need to be checking, and we don't need to be going at stupid doses.
Okay, thank you, Carolyn. Vanessa here. First of all, I just want to say that Vanessa is saying fantastic webinar series, and thank you to all of the presenters. And the question here is, does the compendium cover SNPs, explanations, and nutritional support?
I'll unmute
Yeah,
Cynthia for that to see if she can answer, and then if it's feedback, I'll answer.
All right.
Cynthia?
Are you getting feedback right now?
No.
No, that's really clear. Thank you.
Okay, I put on a headset. The compendium covers the SNPs. There's a summary section for each SNP, and then there's research with each SNP, and then there's the nutrient cofactors in the cases where the research is available. But as far as trying to use the compendium to design a nutritional plan for yourself, I would still say work with a practitioner.
Thank you, Cynthia. I've got some more questions that are coming through. Micheline is saying, what doses do you recommend B6 zinc for pyrols?
Well, it would depend on the level of pyrols. So, for example, if you're seeing someone who has got levels 80, 90, then you're going to go in pretty high. And when I say high, you might be 75 milligrams of pyridoxine, 75 of P5P, and the zinc will definitely depend on your level of zinc. So if someone's presenting with a zinc level of 10 and you know it should be 16, they may well be able to tolerate dosages of 50 to 75. But again, you've got to be monitoring your zinc levels all the time. There are, as Sterling said, there are also a lot of people that do not absorb their B6. So you've also got to look at B6 levels in the bloods, because you can have extremely high levels, which may indicate not that their B6 is high, but they're not absorbing it. And then we look at lysine and things like that. Is that low, and is that affecting the absorption of their B6? So I would always look and see what homocysteine levels are and then dose accordingly. So some people may only need 50 milligrams at most of P5P, but I certainly wouldn't be going over doses, over levels of 100 in B6 in either of them.
I agree. I agree. For folks who have this issue, if they have a tendency to break out in cold sores, sometimes that's an indication that their lysine's low. So that's kind of a hint that they might need lysine as well.
And actually, Sterling, you brought up a really interesting thing with me a couple of weeks ago about the whole glycine connection. You might just want to say a few words on that, because I thought that was pretty interesting. It wasn't something that I knew much about.
Yeah, I mean, lysine's very crucial. Me and Cynthia talked over it in January when we started learning more about oxalates and how to deal with CBS and B6. And Cynthia was actually the one that, I knew that lysine was needed, but I just didn't understand. And Cynthia was the one that, kind of schooled me on how it's needed to, for B6 to be able to hook to receptors and be utilized in the body. So it's very, very crucial. And, there's so many SNPs that are related to the cofactor of P5P. So you always definitely got to make sure that lysine's in play. Because we actually saw one person, I had a dear friend of mine who just lost her life from Lyme disease, and she had, for instance, the oxalate issue, and she had sky-high B6, and so her husband, that was a physician, said, I'm not going to check her for oxalates because her B6 is high, and I said, no, because her lysine's low. Go do this organic acid test. And it was, her oxalates were through the roof, even though she had the B6 in her body, because she had no lysine in her body. Unfortunately, we couldn't help her. She did pass away, but she had been very ill for over a decade with Lyme. But it was, that would have been very crucial to catch in the beginning stages of her Lyme disease, is that lysine being gone for her to utilize the B6. And then you get people that are low B6 and they have neurological issues. You see a lot of people with diabetes, they're low in B6, they give them B6. But then when you get B6 too high, you'll have the neurological damage and issues as well. And I have had another friend that her lysine was depleted, but she was B6 toxic because she didn't have lysine in her body. And she sat there for 3 years with her tongue stinging and burning in her face. And within a week of getting lysine back in her, it was all gone after 3 years of torture. So it's really important.
Yeah. But you were telling me something last week about glycine.
Oh yeah, glycine. Again, people with oxalates and pyroluria, I truly believe pyroluria stems to oxalates, because actually oxalates will bind to zinc and B6. Okay? So it makes sense that it is an oxalate issue. It's just 1 + 1 = 2. In my opinion, it is an oxalate issue, because we see almost everybody with pyroluria has oxalate issues when they check them. And we know that oxalates will bind to zinc and B6. Okay, so it's just common sense when you look at that. So we know that pyroluria is a larger picture, and people that are have oxalate issues just genetically. For instance, you have DAO gene, you're going to be more sensitive to oxalates, and they take in something like glycine. I've had this happen to me. I took a supplement with glycine, and within a few minutes, my fever shot up to 103, and I walked around for 3 hours in a drunken stupor, slurring my words from glycine, and I got fluid on my lungs and got pneumonia. It happened the second time when I correlated it with the glycine, and I had somebody come to me and say, Well, that tells me you have oxalate issues. Have you checked your B6 and lysine? And I was clueless back then. The glycine, another thing, if somebody react badly to glycine, which we've met a few people now that have. You know, me and you talked about that, Carolyn. That was interesting. It's a huge one. And now if you also see DAO SNPs, you know, be eerie of hyperoxaluria. Again, DAO is related to the breakdown of histamine. So we see that a lot of people with mast cell activation, if they get their oxalates under control, or their pyroluria, whatever they want to call it, okay, they get better. And I'm one of them. I used to take anywhere from 6 to 12 Benadryls, that's diphenhydramine for Australians, a day. And that is a whole lot. That is overkill. And that's how I survived. I've been in anaphylactic shock. I've been resuscitated on multiple occasions. And, you know, when I started lowering oxalates, I no longer take diphenhydramine, Benadryl. No longer. A lot of people see that issue resolved. It is, I've actually learned from Susan Costin Owens, 9 out of 10 people who are chronically ill who get tested for oxalate issues have them. 9 out of 10. So it's crucial. Not 1 out of 10, but 9 out of 10. So you all need to remember that.
Sterling, can I butt in and just remind everybody that oxalates are anti-nutrients that are in plants and certain foods, and they're really high in foods that we consider good for us, like spinach and sweet potatoes, and also supplements that that a lot of the supplements that we take, like for liver detox, you have to be careful. If your diet is high oxalate, that's fine, but you have to take the B6 and the lysine to compensate for it if you have any history of kidney stones in your family or yourself. And you also, one of the things you can do to help bind those oxalates up when you're eating those foods is to take like a magnesium citrate or calcium citrate, which will grab on to the oxalate and then pull it out through your digestion without having to be broken down.
Another thing that I would like to add is a lot of people don't realize this. They've been, not only do we have glyphosate, which is what are in GMOs, Roundup is glyphosate. Roundup, the chemical glyphosate turns into glyoxylate, okay? And I think that's maybe why we're seeing such a huge spark in this right now, is because not only are we getting from our food that we could probably handle at one time, now we're loaded down environmentally. And now Stephanie Seneff let me know that now they're also doing new GMOs since the glyphosate's becoming resistant. There's a lot of bugs and stuff becoming resistant to it. They're actually GMOing foods with oxalates themselves because oxalates kill the Krebs cycle.
Yes,
So
I agree.
exactly being a human. So I don't think that this was such an issue pre-1998 as it is now. And why we're seeing more anxiety-ridden people and, you know, people with all the pyroluria and stuff. And, you know, I mean, that's a horrible thing because you stress your body like that. Eventually, you know, people with pyroluria can die of heart attacks from stress. It's not a good thing.
Yes, and particularly when you consider that the stats are telling us that every American at this point is eating their body weight in glyphosate every year.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. This whole thing about pyroluria is really the trans-sulfuration pathway gone wrong.
Yep.
Correct.
It's not a disease. It's just the new box that they've called it, but really it's our trans-sulfuration pathway gone wrong, whether we have SNPs or not. But a lot of it has to do with the glyphosates, as Sterling mentioned.
I honestly think that's the biggest thing.
Yeah.
Okay, we've got some more questions coming through, which is great. Micheline just carried on, I guess, from the previous question she asked. Are you using both prioxidine and P5P to ensure absorption?
Well, pyridoxine is going to have a much more stimulatory effect on the CBS. P5P, much less so. So if you have got someone who is creating amounts of ammonia, or they might be not processing their sulfur particularly well, you're not really going to use a lot of pyridoxine, if at all. You'll be more supporting P5P because it's the active form and it will have less of an effect. So you're really looking at perhaps a combination of both if tolerated, but if not, then you're going to be erring more towards the P5P. Cynthia, you might want to add to that.
Yeah, I would say titrate slowly. Start at a low level and then titrate up.
Okay, Jennifer has a question here. It says, when treating a pyrrole high copper with zinc and molybdenum, sometimes the copper initially rises despite adequate zinc dosing. Is this a CBS issue? I think I've asked that one, haven't I?
No.
No. Okay.
Cynthia, do you want to take that one?
No, you can talk about that, but I'll add something at the end.
Okay, so copper is interesting because obviously copper and zinc, iron, copper, estrogen metabolism, copper, all have a synergistic relationship. And so it won't necessarily be just about the zinc and molybdenum that might be the issue, but it could also be iron and estrogen metabolism affecting it, because you need your sulfur to also break down your estrogens. So, you know, yes, you'll always get movement with copper and zinc, but I don't think that really is an issue. I mean, you would expect that it would move when you're putting in large amounts of zinc, but I think it also has an effect on definitely molybdenum and iron.
Yeah. So when I'm dealing with somebody who's got COP or zinc issues, I also look at iron. I look at ceruloplasm. I look at all the carrier proteins for iron, the iron binding proteins, the percent saturation. I look at the SNPs associated with iron and heme, obviously. They all play together. You can't dissect them off into little separate compartments. They all play together, which is why I always suggest that people work with a practitioner to get the overview and not just, you know, the narrow focus. But copper and zinc kind of compete with each other. And when you see high copper, low zinc, or actually it's usually high copper, low zinc, or it's low copper in some cases, because the copper is being sequestered and not released into the bloodstream, that's a problem as well.
Okay, so, this is a comment, not a question. Scott says he's a clinician. He already has the compendium and appreciates the due diligence and effort all of you have put into creating this result. So thank you for that feedback. He's saying the result is fabulous. I've got another question here from Micheline. If you are not going over 100 milligram for B6 and have low lysine levels, what kind of range of lysine is needed to assist with the absorption?
Who wants to take that?
Honestly, go ahead.
No, you go ahead.
Honestly, with lysine, I do the NutriVal on people, and it measures lysine, it measures all the amino acids, and I look at the recommendations and use that.
Okay.
So
Jennifer,
just one word on that. You know, lysine, we know, particularly if someone has got, you know, herpes virus or anything like that, we can use up to 6 grams a day in that state. So we know that is, you know, definitely a safe level at the higher end of the scale. But, you know, anything between 500 milligrams and a gram a day should be sufficient to help with the B6 levels. But obviously if they're getting any sort of herpes virus or anything in the system, then you would be giving maybe double or even 3-4 times that dose.
Yeah, and lysine, like all these amino acids, are derived from protein foods. So people who are low in these amino acids either have an issue with their hydrochloric acid in their stomach, or they've got some pathway that's malfunctioning and cannibalizing that level. But amino acids, you have a little bit more bandwidth to play with them as far as the amounts than you do with the vitamins.
And don't forget too that arginine is the opposing amino to lysine. So if someone's eating lots and lots of chocolates and nuts and things like that, they could be depleting their lysine that way.
And wouldn't vegans be very low in it as well?
Yes, they would. Unless they're eating lots and lots of almonds and things like that. But yes, they would typically.
Jennifer says here, in the diagram, read the oxidation reduction glutathione. GSS is shown to be inhibited by BCNU. What is BCNU?
Cynthia, that's your slide. I'll just go back to it. I think it's that slide. Maybe ask another question while Cynthia's looking that one up.
All right then. So Micheline is asking, what is your clinical experience in correlation between oxalates and candida? In brackets, they are often together. Do you find addressing oxalates relieves candida?
Yes, it definitely can help. And when you're seeing recurrent candida, definitely be thinking oxalates. But biotin is obviously really important. But yes, that's a key sign of oxalate. Thyroid issues, recurrent candida, kidney stones, learning difficulties, they're all associated or can be associated with elevated oxalates. And so if you, because it's very stimulatory just to the bladder generally, so you can even get urinary symptoms, frequent urination and things like that. So yes, when you reduce the oxalates and you support that pathway and balance with other nutrients that are going to help, then that definitely will make a big difference. Yeah.
Okay.
Okay, so let me jump in about this BCNU.
Please. Oh, okay. Yeah. All right then. Fine. And then I've got just something else that Jennifer said, and then I think we're done.
Do you want to go ahead and do the rest of what Jennifer said, and then I'll jump to the BCNU?
Yeah, sure. She's actually said I meant to say GSR, not GSS.
Right. I got that. Okay. So when you look at a lot of these drawings on these flow charts, and you'll see them in the pathway planner as well, when you see a T-bar with something next to it, for example, under the GSR for the reduction of glutathione, you see that BCNU with a T-bar. That means it blocks it. It doesn't enhance it. It's a blocking agent. So this particular blocking agent is mustard gas. So a lot of the drugs that we're using, and don't even get me started about the drug industry, and don't even get me started, but a lot of the drugs that are used for treating different types of cancers are made from these very dangerous agents, because if you go back to World War II, a lot of the drug companies derived their products from some of the things they were making in the war. That's all I'm going to say about it. But basically, that's a blocking agent for that particular enzyme. So that particular drug is used for brain cancer, like glioma, glioblastoma, that kind of thing. There's another one here associated with gamma GCS. Again, it's another drug. So When you see that T-bar up against an enzyme, that means it's something that's blocking it.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for that. Right, it appears that we don't have any more questions. So just one last time, is there anything that any of you want to add to this before we close the webinar off today?
No, I think that's all from me.
Me too.
Excellent. Well, I just want to then close it off by saying thank you very much to the presenters, of course, and thank you very much for everyone for attending and not only participating, but also your feedback on how beneficial this has been for you to attend. So just to let you know, your next webinar, webinar 6, is on neurotransmitter serotonin dopamine. That's on Thursday, October the 29th at 7:30 p.m. for Dallas, Friday, October the 30th at 11:30 a.m. in Sydney. And just, I won't go through the other ones, but webinar 7, remember that the clocks are changing in Dallas, which will affect us in Sydney. So remember to be on the webinar for 10:30 start. All right, so I'll remind you about that on webinar 6 again. So just say great, thank you very much everybody, and have a good evening and a good day. So we'll see you in a couple of days.